Good afternoon. Hope you can hear me okay. Usual paranoia on this, but the system seems to be behaving itself. Video seems to be working. Got my little frame round. My camera's on. Seems to be okay. So let me know if so. I hope you can hear. And I'm Jack Chew. I should always remind folk of that. If you're new around here, I come live at lunchtimes on weekdays. And sometimes solo, more often than not with a guest. We had a late cancellation today, and so I look at the list and I think, right, what have been people asking me to weigh in on recently? What are the questions that have been coming in? And quite regularly, I'd probably say since this show's existed, the top question, especially if you pulled it over the course of a month, the top question is what your current thoughts on the pandemic, and that sometimes can be quite specific over how do you think test and trace is going? What do you think about the amount of PPE we have to wear? How well do you think these things have been communicated by, whatever, government agencies or more professional bodies and things like that? And we've talked about various different parts of it. And then when I've then had a late cancellation, I look at the list and I think, well, there's still a frequency of which I'm asked that question. Well, what do I think about the state of affairs right now? But more recently, the questions have ended up being around what's topical in this moment, which is the opening up process and procedure. People asking as to whether I think it's too fast, too slow. There's then the notion of vaccine passports, or the not vaccine passports is probably the wrong way of putting it, because most of the legislation that looks like it's going to be drawn up is a passports that or paperwork that would indicate that you are vaccinated or you've had a negative test. And so it's kind of a COVID passport, would probably be the way of putting it, or becoming a papers, please culture. And that is where a lot of the questions have been centered recently. And so I thought I'd weigh on that. Now, it becomes quite a contentious subject, something that I admit that get me on here talking about OA&E, management of back pain, setting up a service, running, the complexity that comes from running a business, how best to handle your marketing, clinical education, right? Much more of a comfort zone. However, as a person, it's someone that I'm happy to riff what would normally be in the pub over a beer, riff on this sort of stuff. Passionate about that too. However, I admittedly don't enjoy these episodes quite as much because of just the amount of pause that how contentious they often are. Now I'm just going to double check that that I'm coming in loud and clear. Yeah, that's all working all right. For those that are tuning in on any group that this gets shared to, so when this gets shared into any groups, then one of the things that I've got to be clear on is that your name doesn't necessarily show on the comments. So apologies to those that are sometimes confused why it shows up as Facebook user. So that's something that is a bit of a glitch that we can work through. And I have a link that I'll post if I notice it happening, whereby you can register so that you can then show your name when you put your comments together. Now, one of the things I wanted to ask you if you're tuning in live is I'm kind of keen to always hear about what your thoughts are on this, and so please do share them. That's kind of the obvious thing, is what's your take on the vaccine passports, the opening up procedures, travel restrictions, other, let's say, when the pandemic sanctions are lifted, what is the legacy? What is the leftover behaviours beyond June? And what are your thoughts on it? So I am interested in that, and I'm really keen for you to share those. But also, I wondered if, before I get stuck into it, whether any of you want to hazard a guess as to where I might stand on it. A bit of a sense check, really, for how you think what my position might be on it. And I'm not going to sit on the fence on it, so it's something that you will be on the right lines or not. But where do you think what would be your best guess as to where I might stand on this with regards to whether or not I think that's a good idea, whether I'd be supportive of them or not? I'd be really fascinated to see if any of you want to weigh in, both with your opinion as to what your take on the matter is, but also your best guess as to mine, because speaking to a few people recently, and I feel like that is something that really, I think maybe people see me as being having strong opinions one or another way, not necessarily being able to place me on something like this, which I think is kind of decent. I'm someone that finds myself being sort of an issue by issue person. But on this, I'd be fascinated to see how I'm managing to come across. So what is your take on that? How comfortable are you with what is being suggested there? As I mentioned earlier, it's this notion of where, be that private businesses or public spaces, especially closed spaces, in terms of public spaces that are also then indoors, requiring proof of vaccination or proof of negative test within, I think they're saying 24, 48 hours, and becoming a country of which producing your papers, producing evidence of something is becomes a social norm. How comfortable are you with that? What's your take on that matter? As well as then whether you feel how porous should the borders be? How comfortable are you with that? How liberal should we be with regards to foreign travel? Because that becomes an interesting conversation, doesn't it? Right, regardless of vaccination rates in the UK being heralded on stuff like that, it's not always not always the end of the conversation really as to the rates of vaccination in the country or the likelihood of spread within the country if we started to sort of liberalize the approach to borders again in the summer. That becomes a big issue. So I'm interested in your thoughts on that. And as per usual, what I'll do is get your comments coming in, and then I'll hide the chat so that I can just riff on this and sit and bring you guys in at the end. So for those interested, of which, as I say, most questions that come in are about this, I'm admittedly deeply troubled by the way that that's gone, and for two reasons. I don't like the outcome. I really am uncomfortable with being a papers please style country. I think that is a bad move. Funnily enough, even in the MSK Manifesto for Reform, which is my think tank that we set up, we actually wrote up, as part of a couple of policies, it mentioned the fact that we are a high trust society and gave evidence for why that is, right? We do have, we go about our lives in such a way that you're typically not expecting that a shopkeeper's going to do you out of your change, right? We kind of go about things, and we have a culture in which we are a high trust society. And I like that. That's something that definitely I would want to try to retain. I feel that that is something that has faded away, and the biosecurity that's been put in place, the biosecurity has been the rationale for why we've sort of taken away that individual trust, or being able to trust each other, and therefore needing government mandate to make sure that they apply authority to behavior, and make sure that there is what might have been something as simple as leaving your house became illegal in some circumstances. Now, I therefore can comprehend various different parts of what's happened over the last 12 months, both in terms of especially the mad Russian panic that occurred. However, I was someone that was fairly clear as to the motivations behind a lot of what went on was to try to bolster the NHS, as well as to try to get a grip of what was going on, understand the disease better, and also understand then how we can best understand the trade-offs between what would be security and liberty. And that mature conversation never occurred, as well as the fact that we weren't able to bolster health services. We didn't have come to understand the disease better, but we've not then enacted policy that would make sense in that direction. So essentially, we've kind of come to understand the transmission is less likely surface transmission and things like that. So we didn't then understand the fact that then should have altered and changed policy accordingly. Instead, we've had fairly draconian measures that have infringed on people's ability to move, etc., for a lot longer than people would have expected. As for the politics of that, we can do that in another show. I'm not going to hide away from it. There's plenty to be said about what could have been done and should have been done differently. However, at this point in time, based on the data we have, as well as the behaviours that we're seeing as the world opens back up. I say the world opens up. I'm speaking fairly UK-centric on this, but as the UK is on its roadmap, its milestones or whatever, and as we start to get back into beer gardens and then into the actual pub, and people often, I think there's a reason people are using these sort of social milestones like that. When can I eat in a restaurant? When can I go out for a beer? When can I go out for a beer in an actual pub? Those sorts of things are really meaningful to people. And as a healthcare professional, I think it's been fascinating how underestimated those things have been. People talk a lot about social determinants of health and understanding the social aspects that surround people's pain presentations or their life experiences that are affecting their health behaviors. And despite that, it's clearly just been a bit of lip service, and people don't think it's as important as other things. People have clearly underestimated loneliness and how that would factor in the power of a hug. And therefore, there's never been a mature conversation about those trade-offs, in my opinion, up to now. And so then, what's making me speak about this now, apart from being asked the question, what do you think about this all the time, and having an opportunity on a late cancellation today to talk about it, is that the vaccine passport situation, whereby you might need to present evidence of vaccine or evidence of a negative tests and stuff to go into, say, a pub, or to go into your local council library, or to be able to live life as normal as might resume. Those sorts of hangovers on something like this deeply trouble me. I see reflections from what happened when we had things like 9/11 and we had this sort of spike in geoterrorism that meant that people were then concerned over how can we decrease the likelihood of tragic events like that happening again. And so I can therefore understand that there's then this craving of security and trying to tidy up certain things. But as we learnt from that, from the Patriot Act and other circumstances whereby the infringement of liberty that comes with that security, and for me, I can't comprehend the fact that they have to come quite as well coupled as that. But often it's the suggestion that, well, in case someone's talking about a bomb plot, therefore we're going to tap your calls. So if you're not talking about anything, you're not doing anything wrong, then you've nothing to worry about. Those sorts of arguments have never sat well with me. I mean, just those that pay attention to this show or know me as a person just know that's certainly I'm not someone who's trusting enough of the state or trusting enough of human nature to forego quite to that level as some people are. And that's something that I see reflections of some of that behavior that occurred then, whereby just distrust and also then a really heavy-handed approach to being able to tap into people's privacy, or bleed away people's privacy, sorry. I feel that's what I'm recognizing here. It feels so heavy-handed to infer that it's worthwhile to actually infringe on people's liberty like this, and that people would then, especially for the variety of reasons of which someone might not have been vaccinated or might not, the potency, if we call it that, or the contagion effects of this virus in its current state, in the way that things are, it fascinates me that these conversations are not just occurring, but it feels like an increasing likelihood that that's going to be enacted, and that I just don't. I think it's not proportional in any way. This is not an Ebola outbreak. It's not to diminish it and the incredible devastation it's had on people's lives and the disruption that's occurred because of it. It's not to downplay. I don't need to downplay, especially on this show. We've talked about it plenty. Downplay the virus, but it's not something that is then. There's no rationale that I can consider that's logical to then offer a suggested disruption to a way of life to the extent that is being proposed. Like, people are trying to, there's plenty of people upplaying the nature of the virus for various things beyond its numbers, and then there's people that downplay what is being suggested by a vaccine and test style COVID passport. And I won't do either of those things. I won't overplay this as if it is an Ebola-like issue, whereby it is something that is so serious that therefore it could be a real extinction level event. And then there's but I also won't downplay what I think is a really significant disruption to the social fabric. As I've mentioned, for those of you just tuning in, I've mentioned a bit about how we're a high trust society, and that's got some challenges to it, but it's also got some big upsides. And the way in which we go about our lives not suspecting our neighbour of nefarious acts, giving the benefit of the doubt, and being that small L liberal nature of just recognizing that it's more likely that we're all in this together as is standard, and that not drawing arbitrary lines by then testing people on that, checking on them, and having them present, say, paperwork to enter buildings, facilities, being able to go about things, the drawing and stigmatizing that can occur on for the various people, various reasons as to why they might not have either had vaccines or tests, or that they are not buying that this is a good idea. The fact that we then could end up with these two-tier systems or situations, of which you've then got these I mean, it'd be quite exciting and interesting in some ways. You know, you've got these bootleg pubs in which people drink where they've not had to present papers and stuff like that. And just imagine what we're suggesting there is that you get the heavy hand of the state turns the police up at a venue that's serving beer to otherwise well adults that are consenting to it and willing to pay the appropriate tax for it, but they just happen to have not presented their paperwork for a vaccine and or a test. It just, for me, it is something that just seems farcical. Now, it's worth me saying that there's various things that I think are silly that go on. There's plenty of them. I mean, I can whinge about a number of different things that can go on. But would this, you know, how bothered am I, right? What would this motivate or animate me to do? I think if the worst of what is being suggested occurs and we end up in a situation where we create a sort of biosecurity state that I think hasn't got an appropriate rationale to it, we've not got a plague level event of which something like that you could vaguely comprehend it being necessary for our survival. Also it's not being done in any sort of sensible and shrewd and light touch way, of which is likely to be a moment in time rather than an infrastructure that is then going to need to sing for its supper for a long period to come. If because those things just aren't occurring, this is something that I think is clumsy, it's irrational, it's unfair, it's unjust, and it's also going to have a legacy that then really makes massive imprints on what is the world and society of which I'd want to live and want to promote and want to champion and influence. Is that especially in its worst form, or even as is kind of what looks like is going to happen, it will animate and motivate me in various different ways. Now, that is something that will make me more political, not just as a person, as a commentator, but I will get stuck in. Right? That is something that's like, right, my tinkering around the edges with musculoskeletal reforms or trying to influence health education for people's better knee pain. That's my day job, right? I'll still get stuck into that. But what I'm meaning is, it sounds dramatic, but essentially the biggest fish to fry becomes the one-way infringement on liberty based on notions of security. That's a far bigger deal. And so it certainly will, it depends how the cookie crumbles. There's still lots of things that need to occur. I'm not going to be dramatic enough to say, that line has been overtly crossed already. I mean, as someone that likes to get all the cards on the table and talk things out and talk about things whereby you then are able to weigh up the sensible trade-offs, I'm already disappointed and despondent about just how poor the debate and discussions have been. However, what conclusions are being drawn from it, and the fact that there's a lack of voices actually standing up for that other side of things and actually applying sensible caution, you've just got no one really being able to explain as to, or even the proponents of stuff like this aren't necessarily saying, look, this is us, these are the trade-offs that we're accounting for, and here's our rationale for why it's still worthwhile. They're not even having to do that, right? It's just more of a, this is what you've got to comply with in order for us to allow you to exist anywhere near what was normal pre-pandemic. And so one of the questions I've asked myself is, what beyond once we're opened up and once we've lifted what are overt COVID sanctions that have been occurring for the last 12 months, what sort of legacy and hangover from that would be acceptable for me? And there are certain circumstances whereby I can so understand there being ongoing needs and ongoing management of certain things, but I can't think of a reason as to when I would be, obviously with this virus, right? Not considering other variants, other viruses, other circumstances, that the behaviour of the disease is different. But in this, I just think we need to create infrastructure to understand how we can best live with it, and then try to aspire to rebuilding society in the image of what was, because what was certainly, it had its problems, and I was always going on about them to some extent, but there's plenty of good of it, right? There's plenty of history that came before, there's plenty of learning that's occurred that had tidied things up. And also, there's just no consensual mandate that's occurring for this sort of behaviour. You know, it's a fascinating thing that we've got this one-party state at the moment, where you've got an opposition that's not opposing. You've got a first past the post system that means it's very difficult to enact political change like that. And so it just seems fascinating to me, just how one way the conversation is, never mind the traffic and policy. So yeah, it's something just to give you an idea. You know, if it's something that is going to continue in this vein, and the conversation is going to continue in this vein, and that's certainly something that will animate me, and probably be more politically involved, admittedly, than I would as a otherwise relative bystander. Which is much probably to the pain of my friends and family, who think, God, could he be any more political anyway? But yeah, probably. You'll see that I can, because yeah, I am really concerned. I think probably more so. I've not talked about concern and worry too much. I've had other things to worry about, perhaps. But the main thing has been that I feel like I've been observing there's been some really concerning features across the pandemic, but there's just been a massive amount of incompetence that's occurred that then has led to us needing to climb out of this in a weirder way than we would have expected. And here we are, though. This is something that seems, if not nefarious, then certainly clumsy beyond measure. And incompetence can't then lead to us living in a police state. It just seems so bizarre, and a major infringement on people's abilities and liberties to make their own choices and choices for their families and stuff, and the consequences and social sanctions that would land on people that made other decisions. Just seems fascinating, and I just don't think is okay at all. So David Poulter, this is interesting. He said the UK already has checks like automated car insurance and tax. Most watched via cameras. Is this different? Well, the most watched via cameras is certainly something I'm not best pleased with either. So that's something I wouldn't go with. But I don't think the analogy of car insurance and tax would be a problem. Sorry, is a fair cross analysis. The checking on something like that, and then the option to, you can say, well, if you don't want to insure it, you can not have a car, right? Well, in this instance, you can't participate in society, is what is being suggested, right? If you don't comply with these standards, the opt out of then saying, right, if you have a moral problem with car insurance, and you choose not to, or car tax, and you choose therefore not to drive, then you're opting out of a feature of that, of which many people do. But it's not the same as then being that you can't participate in society, which is what is being proposed. You think about what people would and wouldn't be able to access under this scheme, from what I can gather. And this is why, as the detail emerges, I'll refine my position. But yeah, I don't think that analogy carries, to be honest, David. And I do think it's therefore significantly different, unless it's not different, right? Unless it isn't something like that, of which then that requires me tidying up and explaining my position slightly differently. So yeah, where do you guys stand on this? Are you bothered? Is it something that animates you? Is it something that you feel passionate about? I noticed that my old mate Ben Metcalf, he said hi earlier on the chat, so I'm just noticing some friendly faces there. So do let me know as to what your thoughts are on this, and whether this is something that you're bothered about. Does it surprise you that I'm bothered about it? I'm interested. Certainly interested in what your thoughts are, and I know that it will inspire future conversations, and that's what usually happens on this show and beyond. Now, what does it mean in healthcare? That's one of the questions that's come in. Thank you, Sandra, for sending that. What would I be happy with in healthcare? I'm still interested in seeing what would occur in terms of what PPE people would expect us to wear, etc., ongoing. I find that interesting, but the main reason is that I think it's really silly if there's a precautionary principle that means that we end up wearing masks for a long time in physiotherapy. If it's then, much like has occurred in various different times in hospitals, in intensive care units, or people that are particularly immunocompromised, then PPE is a standard thing. if they then extend that into sports and MSK injury for an extended period beyond the pandemic, I think that again, people are missing out on understanding what it is that you lose when you enforce those sorts of measures. And for me, the mask is, you know, the fact that you can't read your patient and they can't read your facial expression means you're taking 10-20% off the top of that interaction all the time. And you therefore not you're compromising the care delivery on something that is already fraught with challenges. You know, the ability for us to appropriately scale the function of people's lives as they come to see us with their sore bits is already a challenge, right? It's what I talk about on this show and beyond. It's my whole project is to raise standards in our industry, and it's already difficult. When you're then asking us to do that behind a mask, I think it's being underestimated how much that is compromised. I think that video technologies are really helpful for that. I've said to people before, particularly when it's a complex case, complex third or eighth opinion that I'm seeing. Sometimes I'd rather do the subjective history over a screen so that I can be without a mask than to do it in person with a mask. That does change with regards to an objective assessment. It is better in person, in my opinion, and the care delivery, depending on them, can be then split between two functions. But I think that then, when asked, as I have been here, what would I be happy with in healthcare, is that, you know, the hygiene standards that we should be held to anyway, that should be a given, and probably, you know, that's been too unchecked in my opinion, and various different governance level policy style understanding as to what you can do practicing in healthcare in the UK. I think that's somewhat unregulated. But when it comes to individual behaviors, is that I think we need to get back to me being expected as a clinician to maintain good hygiene, patients expecting to not have to wear masks, and for their clinician to be in visors and bibs and gloves and stuff as soon as possible. And so I think if then the precautionary principle means that for the rest of this calendar year, as we do now, patients come in and we have to wear a mask, a gown and gloves, etc. I think is really silly, really clumsy. And it also hyper-medicalizes something that we need to try and demedicalize a little bit. I need to get back out into the community. I need to go to people's gyms and pools with them and be treating them in the community, going out for a walk with them, going for a run with them, and getting involved in things more hands-on in what is their normal day-to-day. Whereas at the moment, it's kind of being contained to clinic rooms, which is something we were trying to grow out of. And I think that that's something that we need to make sure that we don't succumb to making those sorts of mistakes and just thinking, well, let's err on the side of caution and then let it stand forever. And so, yeah, I think it's a worrying principle. And also, one of the big things that I've not touched on as much in this, but we can probably do another time, is that whilst I understand, more so than I understand what we've just been talking about, I haven't got a lot of time for, and I think it's being totally overplayed and not a good conversation being had about it. But the travel restrictions with nations that have otherwise continued to have more major problems with the virus, you can comprehend that logic as to the fact that you've got internal policies might be more liberal than external policies and the porousness of borders. But one thing to be said on this that I'm passionate about is that understanding, one of the best ways to understand each other cross-culturally and to decrease and inoculate against things like bigotry and prejudice and the various phobias that can occur when we don't really truly empathize with each other is travel. Exposing yourself to that and coming to realize it, and being in a different country and realizing that they're going through what we're going through. There is an experience that is to be human, that is far more relevant to our place of origin, our race, our creed. You know, those things matter less. Travel is incredibly important to that. And I think that therefore a more nationalistic restriction on borders, even in the guise of biosecurity, is something that I think is another really silly mistake that we could end up making or continue to make. And that although you can at least draw a line of logic between those things, I just don't think it's wise for those to continue for a moment longer than they need to. So that's enough from me. Bit of a soapbox one, to be honest, and I definitely would love to chat about this more with you all. Thanks for those that have commented and contributed, and those that have baited me into this over recent weeks by submitting your questions. Really appreciate the chat. We've got an interesting one that's probably not, you know, it's adjacent to this conversation at the very least, with Ashri Singh tomorrow, who's talking about BAME hesitancy for vaccines in the BAME community. I've just had a question, last thing, which is a valid question, from Sam. He's asked, "Have I had the vaccine?" Yes, I have. Yeah, as a health professional, I think I was with them in the first batch, and it's something I gave plenty of thought to. But yeah, I had my vaccine. I can't remember which one, but yeah, I had the vaccine, and so yeah, my opinions on this aren't necessarily being fueled by the fact that I'd be one of those people that would be kept out of the pub. Yeah, that's irrelevant actually to my argument on this. But yeah, fair question. Thanks so much as ever for your time, guys. I'll see you tomorrow, and another great show planned on Friday with. Oh no, I haven't. It's Good Friday, isn't it? Brilliant. Right, so I'm off on Friday. So yeah, enjoy me and Ashry tomorrow, and then I'll see you next week. All right, all the best. Oh, I clicked the wrong button. Where's my fancy video gone? There we go. See you tomorrow.